Hello, everyone. So in today's conversation, our guest is Steve. Many of us in the user research space already know who Steve is, but for those who don't, Steve is a user research expert, and he runs his own consulting company called Portigal Consulting. He's also an author of a very popular book called Interviewing Users. And today I'm really excited to have Steve here because in his book, he talks about the most fundamental thing of user research, that is how to interview users. And if you've read the book, or you're into product development as a career, you know how important tool that is, right? So, Steve, welcome to this chat, and thanks for agreeing to do this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to get to speak with you.
Great. So, Steve, I would like to start with the first question about your journey from 2001 to now. I think you started your consulting company in 2001, so that was the start of this century. So, what have you seen changing in these 23 years, and probably what has stayed the same? So if you can talk about those two things.
Yeah, certainly. And I started my career even before that, working at another consultancy. Um, just think about over that time how user research was not something that was known about to how widely accepted it is now, how many people have that title, how many researchers there are. And regardless of what people's employment status is, as of today, there's still a community of practice of people who have that skill, who advocate for the work. And you just can think about how that has grown and grown and grown. And I think there's a couple of inflection points for me. If you go back to sort of, the beginning of the century, most of the user research work, not all, but most of it took place in agencies and consultancies. It wasn't part of how organizations structured themselves. And eventually that did get insourced, to use that buzzword, and became part of the organization, part of kind of, tech culture. And then but then that also matured over time. And because I think early on you might have seen researchers kind of on their own, maybe
Mhm.
with less experience, maybe part of a team that did something else. But eventually research became a practice, which meant you had teams of people with different skills, different levels of experience, and eventually leaders, people that were peers to the head of engineering, the head of design, if we're talking about tech companies, and that could kind of advocate at a leadership level for how research could and should be done. And those are like those change the way research is being practiced and kind of the impact that it has in a way that's just so different than when it was something that was just done by consultancies. I still am a consultancy of one. So, my own bias is I guess there's pros and cons. I definitely have a bias to the way that I work as someone who's outside the organization, isn't part of that culture and structure, but can kind of be on the outside. But you can see what can be accomplished by people that own problems, own relationships, and live with them kind of over years and years and years. So yeah, I think that that's really been a fundamental sort of long-term shift over that time. You also asked
Yeah.
what stayed
Mhm.
the same.
Yeah. So,
Um,
what has stayed the same in last 23 years? Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a fundamental thing that we're trying to do, right? To understand something about a person that's is a customer, that's going to be a customer, that is a user, that maybe is purchasing something, that is using something that impacts what we as people that are producers of things, we're trying to understand them. We're trying to learn from them and apply that to decisions that the organization needs to make to succeed, to empower people. I think that doesn't feel any different. I think it's work that I think people get into and have a lot of passion for. And I think that feels the same to me as it
Mhm.
always had. There's more of us, so you kind of can feel the collective passion of the field, and meet more people and kind of be involved in more conversations. But I think that thing that unites us, that we advocate for, and that we deliver, still feels the same to me as when I started, even going back to the 90s.
Yeah, great to hear that, Steve. And in terms of the importance of user research, has that changed over time? Because in initial days, when let's say in 2001, 2005, early days of digital products, probably there was more chances of things going wrong. Slowly, things started becoming standardized. Like you can just pick up inspiration from web. You can just there's so much that has been standardized. Like so the room for error has reduced over time. Like, what is the how have you seen the importance of user research changing? Is it the same? Is it uh, how does that change?
If you go on social media, there's a hashtag WTFUX, and you
Mhm.
guess kind of what WTF stands for. And people share
Mhm.
things when they kind of can't believe that
Mhm.
some part of a user experience has shipped that is so broken or so misunderstood or so wrong. Um, just the other day, as in terms of when you and I are recording this, the site Reddit published, I think, guess it's their version of like Spotify's wrap up, whatever that Spotify tool is called. Sorry for being uncool here. And it does the thing that we've seen technologies do forever. It surfaces something from your past and then it celebrates it. And so you've seen people kind of responding on social media with, a question they posted to Reddit about the loss of, a bankruptcy or the loss of a family member or something very difficult. And their Reddit their algorithm serves it back up to kind of say, hey, here's an important thing. Let's celebrate. I think one of the taglines they use says, put it on the fridge, like it's, your children's artwork that you're very proud of. So it's really tone deaf. And this is not new, right? We've been seeing this for years and years and years with kind of algorithms surfacing bereavement and trying to celebrate it. So, you know, do we still need user research? I mean, we have the tools to solve this. We even know that they are problems because we have a legacy of this kind of as a design field. And yet Reddit makes a mistake that Facebook hadn't learned from 10 years ago. I don't know that research is the only cause of that or is the only solution, but I guess I take issue with the fact that any claim that like we've solved all this because we haven't, because we keep making mistakes. And the example I gave is an example where the mistake is obvious to anyone that looked at it, and we have a history of doing it wrong. As companies try to innovate by creating new products to solve new problems, to look at new behaviors or new tasks, or respond to things that are kind of changing the culture, there's no way that people making those things know enough about who's doing it, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what they're trying to integrate with, how they feel about it, in order to kind of create products that that can get there for people. Now, maybe we have design patterns, and so we should know how to do a date picker. We should know how to do some of these things. But again, look at some of those hashtags, and you see products that are out there to like buy tickets at a kiosk or um, uh, yeah, Dan Safford posted something a couple of years ago. I think it was how many eggs to add on your order of your sandwich. And it was like a picker that would scroll from like 1 to 900 or something like that. Like it was a completely brain dead use of a design pattern. So you know, I, we need a lot of things to be better. And I think,
Yeah.
for certain to get to a better UX, and I think research is a really crucial component of that. Even though we have better tools to design, we still need to inform the design decision based on people. I think that to me, that hasn't changed.
Yeah, completely agreed with that. And I think we'll cover more on how AI products mostly suffer from these kind of issues, usability issues, and probably are not tested enough. But maybe towards the end of this conversation, I have dedicated section to talk about AI. But the next thing that I wanted to ask is that there are companies where there's a research team. There are companies where PMs and designers, they themselves are doing research, right? And we talk about how democratization is kind of risky. Uh, So for everyone's benefit, I just wanted to kind of hear from you, like what are the risks of democratization that everyone should be aware of, especially the companies where there are no UX researchers, like what could go wrong for them?
Right. And is it, I mean, I guess we could get a little fiddly with the terms, although I'm not the person to try to put a hard definition on democratization. Um, but so I think the scenario you're describing where, or two scenarios, there are researchers, but also other people are doing research, and there are no researchers, but people are doing research. And I think this is like always a great debate, and or at least as a good thought exercise. I've asked people myself, is bad research better than no research? And because I think that's the heart of the risk, right?
Hmm.
Or at least the first stage of the risk. Um, uh, and I think one camp of response there says like, it's good, if anytime you've got people in the company believing that they don't know, they have to ask people to listen to them and learn from them, that's better. So I think, culturally, what's the impulse? How do we think about who we are as a company? How do we think about our relationship to our users? I think that impulse is really, really good. I think there's a business risk if the quality of the research is poor. Let's just say if the quality of the research is appropriate to the experience level of the people doing the research without even judging it, just we all perform at the level of our own experience, then I think that creates risk of making a wrong decision, getting the wrong information and making the wrong decision. So that is certainly a risk. It's an addressable risk because I think you can improve skills and be aware of where you're at. um, and I think maybe there's a secondary risk if a company does research in kind of a naive or inexperienced way and they don't get great information, then they maybe don't know what to do with it. I've heard that story. Like we did
Hmm.
research and we don't really know what we got, so I'm not sure why we should do it anymore. Or they act on bad information and they see a negative result. Sometimes the consequence of that is blaming research overall, as opposed to looking at the quality or the sophistication of the way that you did the research. We did research, we didn't get anything out of it, it steered us in the wrong direction. We're not going to do research. So I think if it turns people or a culture off of research overall, I think that's a risk. And I think in situations where you have research leaders or researchers who can't do all the research the company needs. They just can't. The demands are greater than the supply, which I think is a really good thing. If there's more questions than we can possibly get to, it supports the importance of research. It supports the need to grow that capability, whether you're helping the PMs build their skills, you're hiring more researchers, or hiring research leaders. I think all those things. If you have researchers and research leaders who are thinking about not gatekeeping and controlling their research, but trying to empower the organization, and helping people with skills, helping people with infrastructure, helping the organization decide what kinds of research questions are best suited to people with different kinds of experience, so that
Hmm.
they can. I think you need research experience to help build a more mature practice overall. So the kind of the decisions that are being made about what to study, how to study it, who's going to study it, can get that guidance. The researchers don't have to do everything. They can't do everything, but they can provide guidance and kind of inform and support other folks. I think that's the ideal, but for sure there are risks, I think, without that kind of maturity or insight about how to even approach this.
All right, got it. Steve, and you mentioned two things. One is, I mean, the risk is bad research producing bad results, maybe like which might lead to building a wrong product, right? And the uh, second was about like not seeing the value because the research quality was not good, right? So I would like to touch upon the first one, which is the bad research led to, let's say, the bad product. Can you share an example of like how it could go wrong, or maybe like some like the worst cases that you have seen, or the most funny cases that you have seen in your career? so that everyone can relate to,
Yeah.
how a bad research looks like.
Yeah, so I mean, depending on your age and where you live in the world, you may remember this story or not. But that question makes me think about Coca-Cola, which is sort of and maybe it's an old story now, but for a long time it was kind of the classic sort of innovation failure story. Um, and so years and years and years ago, Coke and Pepsi were they were, and again, this may vary, around the world, but certainly in North America, Coke and Pepsi were like the two dominant beverages, and they each I think Coke was always slightly ahead. Um, and Coca-Cola did some product testing. Now, let me just say that everyone has a version of the story. Every consultant has a version of it. I don't know that mine is accurate, but let's just assume that there's some accuracy here. I think to illustrate your point. Um, so Coca-Cola did their user research was taste testing. Again, that was kind of what I think Pepsi used to do a lot of advertising where they would have people do blind taste tests of Coke and Pepsi, and they would always pick Pepsi. Taste, if you didn't know what it was, you liked the taste better. And then Coca-Cola, I don't know if it was directly in response to that, but they created another, they iterated their taste, their formula, and they did their own taste tests and they came up with a version of Coca-Cola that they thought tastes better, that people would like better. And so they launched it. It was called New Coke. They kind of redesigned the can. It was like a huge, huge campaign, which again, if you're old enough, you'll remember this. And they took Coke off the market, the thing that people knew. They got rid of it and they put this new thing out there. And it was terrible. It was like one of the biggest product failures ever. And so Coca-Cola quickly changed the direction and they brought back Coke, but they called it Coke Classic. And eventually they got rid of New Coke. Like over time, they basically had to reverse what they had done. I can't imagine how many millions, if not billions of dollars they spent. And I think there's some interesting, again, we can sort of theorize what are sort of user research things. Like they tested it, people liked it better. Why didn't people want to buy it? And I think that idea of taste testing, like blind taste testing, that treats the human being as sort of a mechanism with taste buds as opposed to a person with emotions, right? And there's years and years of research around taste testing where this goes back like hundreds of years, right? Not hundreds of years, but like 100 years, I think, where they put cheap whiskey in fancy bottles and fancy whiskey in cheap bottles as whiskey or wine or something like that. And people they liked the fancy bottle better. And so you can say, well, people are stupid, or you can say, well, people bring a lot of emotion and meaning and context into their experience. And Coca-Cola, that's so you can do a taste test that's blind and people's, taste buds will perform a certain way, but that imagines they don't have any kind of meaning associated with it. And you think about these beloved brands like, I don't know if anybody loves McDonald's hamburgers for the burger, but it's a whole performance of an experience that's got culture and memory and visual stimulation and storytelling. And the product, you experience the product because of that larger set of factors. And so, if you can no longer get the Coke that you grew up with, and you get this new thing that maybe, again, from like a taste bud point of view, tastes better, that doesn't represent a rich understanding of what those customers value. And it was an embarrassing business case that, people sort of laughed about and, still tell that story. And so I think that's a case where they asked a question, but they didn't ask the right question, right? Does it taste better? Is one thing. Would you buy that? I don't know what they asked. You can imagine them asking questions like, if this was your drink, would you like this? Yes, it tastes really good. Did they ever ask, how would you feel if we took away the other one? You can imagine they didn't ask that. Or did they ever try it in the bottle or with the logo and see what associations that had? Yeah, so I don't know. To me, that's just like the greatest, awfulest
Yeah.
story about like research. They did research and they didn't ask the right questions, or they didn't hear the right information, and they made a terrible, terrible business decision.
Yeah. So I'm trying to draw an analogy of Coke with the digital products. So in Coke, it was not just about the taste, it was also about the emotional value and how it connects to the consumer. In the design world, would that analogy translate to, that the design and the product shouldn't just be usable? I mean, usability testing, it doesn't tell you the success of that product. It has to be much, much more deeper. It has to be about how deeply does it connect to the end user. Am I right when I say that?
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yes. And, I know I've heard people talk a little sometimes about, you know, the idea of removing friction from a transaction isn't always good, that sometimes friction, has value. It sort of supports someone's decision-making process or their confidence. So, I love what you're saying, right? That there is sort of it's not just the usability performance, there is a deeper meaning and value. But I don't think you even have to go that far. If you just say, oh, we want to speed up every transaction, then without looking at how does that feel or what does that mean, or, without sort of measuring some even small human aspect of that experience, I think you can miss some aspects. And so when we kind of say, "Oh, friction is bad," reducing time on
Hmm.
task is the goal. Um, you know, the cliche, right? You manage what you measure. So what are you kind of designing towards? Um, I mean, you see this a lot with features that are put into like social media products that are there to create engagement but create frustration because somebody is responsible for some metric. So they put something in there that gets you to do something that shows up in some metric, but it's frustrating the thing that you're trying to achieve. So even just asking, right? Like, okay, here we've done some usability tests to move someone from A through B through C through D. Hey, person who's doing that, what are you trying to achieve in those steps? And how do you feel kind of at the beginning or at the end? I don't think you have to get to like the deep cultural meaning and legacy of these tasks. Like Coca-Cola is
Hmm.
like a big legacy product. I think you can just try to match our assumption about the way we're going to fix this for you and the experience that you have with that, and see if those things are in harmony or if they're in opposition, and choose when to put ingredients like friction back in if they get a better result for somebody.
All right. And those kind of things can only come from from deep understanding of the users and how they are using your product.
I mean, I think deep is a big word. I think deep goes from 1 to 11, and I don't think you need to go to 11 to get some of
Hmm.
these things.
Hmm.
Like, you maybe just have to ask.
Hmm.
Um, I think even a shallow understanding of,
Hmm.
performing a task might be sufficient to understand something tactical and transactional, like how friction
Hmm.
helps people feel like they're not making mistakes, if that were something. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I guess I'm trying to not, I don't want this to feel intimidating. Like, we always need a deep
Hmm.
understanding.
Hmm.
Sometimes we need
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
um, a bit more of a human understanding of the person
Hmm.
behind something. And that could just take a little bit of effort, but would be hugely transformational in the way that we're thinking about the problem and our opportunity to address it.
All right. All right. Got it, Steve. And going back to the previous point where you said the second point of where research could go wrong was that when you cannot derive insights from it. I mean, those insights are not actionable, or you've done your research but you don't know what to do with it, right? So what's your advice to, let's say, the researchers who do research as a profession, but they're not able to convince stakeholders, or they're not able to get buy-in from the stakeholders because of the same reason, right? So what's your advice to them to kind of make it actionable? Like, what is the one core recipe to make it more actionable to the stakeholders?
Right. I think it's another debating a topic that researchers debate is, do researchers provide recommendations? Um, So, I mean, one way to make it actionable is to provide the action that you recommend somebody takes. And I think there's two different ways of thinking about it. Um, I guess I'm not in favor of providing recommendations. I want to collaborate to provide recommendations. I want to identify the problem, or here's the criteria for success, or here's the barrier that people have to overcome. Um, because I feel like in my role as a researcher, and this may vary by team, I don't always know, I don't know what is possible. I mean, that's the designer's job, that's the PM's job, that's the engineer's job, is to generate solutions based on criteria with a lot of expertise and creativity. And so I want to have a collaboration where, I can talk about the gaps, the misunderstandings, and I might say, here's what I like to do. I might like to say, for instance, if we did this, this would change how things work. For instance, if we put more friction in, and what I'm hoping is that people will say yes and, right? They will come up with other solutions. And so as a researcher, I'm trying to set up the relationship with my designers, my engineers, my PMs, everybody that I'm working with, so that we work on this together, and I'm not sort of throwing over the wall a set of conclusions, but I am, bringing them into a conversation. And I don't expect them to sort of take this, like I have to facilitate that discussion. And I might have to sort of, I think giving them a for instance is part of something you might do in a workshop or something you do in a discussion or a brainstorm, so that you kind of bring a conclusion, an insight, a finding, and you give them the question you want to help them answer. And, people have probably heard, how might we, right? How might we create an experience where people feel confident at the end? Because I've identified the problem from the research, and even though I might think, oh, if we change this or we change that, and of course there are things that you learn in research that are wrong, right? Hey, when we close this tab, it actually takes us to last year's instead of this year's landing page. So then, that's just a fix we can kind of put through. So I think as a researcher, when you find those things, they're kind of the low hanging fruit. You document them, you make people aware of them. Um, you know, Yeah, you asked for one thing. I kind of gave you kind of more than that. And I think just what's blocking people is sometimes there's a lack of awareness of how much effort it takes to do analysis and synthesis of research data. And, I think some experts will say like it's 2 to 1. So for every hour you spend gathering data, you should plan for 2 hours to make sense of the data. If you don't do that, if you just kind of, talk to some people and you think about what you remember that you heard that was interesting and kind of tabulate it, or, make a list of it, um, that could be wrong. That for sure misses some of the nuance and some of the bigger things that sometimes doesn't kind of aggregate to a thing that we can take action on. So it's back to that, poorly executed research, not as just the asking questions, but it's also, what happens afterwards. So knowing that that's the effort that you have to put in, and agreeing ahead of time that resource commitment is there so we can get the value out of it. And everyone should be aligned on that before we start doing research. We should all agree, this is what we're going to do. Here's what the researchers are going to do. Here's how the rest of the team is going to be involved, and making that kind of clear, and having a commitment to be aligned on the approach. Showing up kind of unwanted at some random time and saying, well, here's what we have for you. Yeah, that's not a great collaboration. I think that limits stuff being seen as actionable.
Understood. All right. And one challenge that researchers face is also about, when they present their findings, stakeholders would say, hey, we knew it already. Like, this is not something new. I mean, we knew it. What are you bringing new to the table, right? So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's familiar to anyone that's done research. I have a few thoughts about that. Um, I think there's some kind of phenomenon there. I mean, one is that recognition is different than recall. So when I see something that just is clear and makes sense, um, I think sometimes the things that people say we already knew that are not things that anyone's ever articulated before. They had never said that. because, hey, I sat down with them at the beginning of the project and talked about what they knew, and they never told me that. So first of all, let's sit down at the beginning and
mm,
talk about what we believe, what we expect, what we're concerned about.
mm, mm,
So you can point back to and say, like, hey, well, that never came up. I think you're recognizing it as sort of a truth because it feels right, but it's not a thing that we knew. We didn't talk about it. We hadn't documented it. We hadn't acted on it. And there's this thing called hindsight bias. It's a cognitive bias it's very human and natural, which is like it's the we already knew that bias. It's a tendency to, kind of respond to information in a way where we don't acknowledge it as new. So I think setting up that initial conversation, um, and I think in terms of presenting research, again, if you have that initial conversation, you're much better set up for this, presentation at the end. I try to learn what people know and what they believe. And the research is often, not always, but the research is often different than that. And so when I can come back and say, hey, we thought, it's not you or me, it's we thought X, but in
mm,
fact, the thing that we learned is slightly different. And I think that's often often how it comes out. There's a delta, there's a nuance. So to be able to present that delta, we thought, and this has happened to me in research projects, we thought that people wanted this installation to be done quickly. And so we've got all these features to optimize the installation. And the research that I did revealed that people wanted the research to be done right. And they saw these features as being effective in helping them get it right so that they didn't have to come back and fix it. So quickly is still kind of in there, but there's a shift in the meaning. It's not that our client team
mm,
was wrong. It's that thing that they thought actually has some nuance on it. So it's not, I think if you come in and say, well, we learned, hey, people wanted to be done right. Well, the response is going to
mm,
be, well, of course, like that's everything that we build. We know that people want that. If you come back and say, we approach this with the understanding that the most important benefit was to have it done quickly, but the actual thing is slightly different. It's about being done correctly. And so you're starting off with, and this is, I think, is a compassionate way to talk to people. It's not to say you're wrong or to say, guess what? I discovered how the world works, right? And with kind of a lot of
mm,
arrogance. I think both those things set you up not to be received well. But to say, like, we were here and now we're here, and that difference, linguistically might be small, but it changes everything about how we want to, design and deliver these features. I think that can help people move from where they were to where you want them to go. And the final thing that I'll say about that is that, and I've had clients be really great about this, validation isn't a bad thing. If
mm,
we
mm.
assumed something and then we established that it was true, well, now we've really reduced our risk in acting on that. So, I think you can kind of reframe this in a lot of different ways and kind of highlight the positive aspects of it. And stand up for the value that the research is providing and help somebody else kind of understand that and act on it.
All right. And does storytelling as a skill plays an important role in how you're, presenting those insights to your stakeholders? Let's say everything being equal to researchers, one who's very good at storytelling might actually make the insight more digestible, more well received by the stakeholders versus someone who's not that good at storytelling. So does storytelling play any role here?
Yeah, I am a big fan of storytelling as just a way of being and of communicating, I think as advocating. And I think, a great storyteller is someone that can tell stories in a lot of different ways. Um, and it's not just, verbally saying, once upon a time, this happened and that
Mhm.
happened. And then the
Yeah.
moral of the
Mm,
story is, right, that
mm,
that there are just many forms of storytelling. And I think, researchers that can, you know, create deliverables, to kind of be jargony about it, that can share the results of research in a variety of ways. Um, and we talk about sort of the media. Um, I've got a client right now that that they like reports, they like documents, not even decks, but they like reports. And so we do reports for them. But they've been really good at asking for, and I was a little surprised at this at first. What they like is a recording of me like talking through the document. And that's it. So it's an artifact. I made one yesterday. It takes 15 minutes. I'm kind of reading the document aloud, but of course I am adding little bits of emphasis or some parenthetical things. Like I'm doing a bit of storytelling. It's a presentation. And they have given me feedback like that this helps. I read the document, but when I heard you talk about the document in a recording, not even live face to face, I understood it better. And so they've kind of created that as a storytelling norm in their organization, and they've kind of taught me. They've asked me to create that format for them. I wouldn't have thought that was a thing to make. So I think there are so many different ways to do this, and team to team, stakeholder to stakeholder, project to project, like the ways in which we create stories. I think we should be very diverse about what that looks like. Right, the format that you and I are using right now is a sort of a form of a we're telling stories, and the thing that you're creating that you're going to publish from this is a story that takes the form of an interview that's over video, that's kind of a question and answer. Like that's a format. So I think I would encourage researchers or anybody that's trying to kind of share information to be creative in like how they tell stories. I think it's within all of us to do that. I think it's a very human thing. And your point, yes, some people are better at it than others, but we can practice this and be creative with it. And yeah, just have more impact by, choosing the right way to share this stuff.
Great, great. I think, yeah, thanks for sharing those examples, Steve. And uh, the next question that I want to ask is like that most companies are stuck on design testing, usability testing in the name of user research, but like relatively fewer organizations uh, do more than that, right? Invest in generative exploratory research. So what's your take on that? I mean, apart from design testing, which is the most common form of user research, which has been adopted, what are the other essential type of research that companies should do?
Right. I mean, I think you use some great like terms there, right? Generative and exploratory. Um, and I think there's research to understand what should we make, which sometimes is research about, hey, we're going to be building for a new user. How do we understand what they care about, how they work, how they purchase, what their task flow is, what other tools they have, what we need to be integrating with. Like it's the research that you do. It might be to understand a new market, to identify a new opportunity. I think you can imagine sort of almost like a gradient as you start off very broad and get more and more specific. Those are still questions that you can answer before you start building something, before you figure out what to build. Um, there is work that looks like testing. I don't want to call it testing, but because it's not. But creating prototypes, creating wireframes, creating representations of a solution. So, right, I just gave the example of, how do you work? Because I want to understand what to make. I think there's a piece that comes later than that, which is here's an idea of something that we could make, help us understand how this fits or doesn't fit for you. And so this is where you're doing paper prototyping. You're not building code. Maybe you're creating very deliberately unrealistic, unfinished visualizations of things. If you make prototypes that look like the finished product, and you ask somebody, how well does this fit? You're showing them something that looks like it's about to ship. If you show them something that is drawn by hand, that looks like a cartoon, that has little squiggles instead of text, that just highlights the important aspects of what you're trying to get feedback on, now you're inviting that person to speculate about what's possible. So, even if you're going to show prototypes, you want to figure out what kind of prototype to show Like how high fidelity or low fidelity is it? What aspect of the experience are you presenting that's tied to what your question is? So you can kind of start at though, hey, what are people like and what do they care about? And we can think about what to build to, hey, we have some ideas about what to build. Help us understand that and how that fits to, hey, we're starting to build this. We have some actual prototypes. Can you test this? Now we get into kind of testing, but kind of early testing to kind of that final validation testing. So I think there's just so much to be done up front. And I will say that that upfront stuff doesn't have to be when there's no product. Like you have a product, there's a history of it. You can still go out and look at the people that are using your product, not to test current usage, but to understand the larger context in which your customers and users are engaging with you. To think about, okay, we're going to make changes, over the next 18 months. What kind of things are important to them? So it's this whole cycle of where your progress through something is more and more refined and concluded, but you can kind of ask questions all the way along the way based on what decisions are kind of in front of you.
All right. And any advice for the founders who might use such kind of, maybe research methodologies in the early stage of their product? Maybe they don't even have a product, they are just figuring out how to do it. I mean, what I'm trying to ask is that, like, at enterprise levels, there's still some research that happens in big companies, but at very early stages, I've not seen many founders doing user research, and we know that 80% of the startups or more, they don't survive, right? I mean, of course, like there are many other factors which are needed to make a startup survive, but then can user research decrease that failure of a startup, like even by a
Right.
tiny bit? What's your thought on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I think sometimes we use the phrase product market fit is sort of what gets talked about, at that stage of things. It seems like in startup culture, there's a philosophy of build to learn, as opposed to, and just again, my own biases are kind of learn to build. Um, and I think startup folks come up with, like, they get this inspiration around something that is new, that doesn't exist, that's a gap. And I think that spark is something that folks want to hold on to. And when I hear those sparks, I always feel like, wow, that is super interesting. It would be great to do research to try to unpack that, because they've often identified something where we're collectively stuck. We don't know kind of how to get around that. And their idea, I guess when I talk to startup people, they talk about the need they've identified and their solution. And I get very excited about that need. And I don't even really care about the solution because I don't think that need has been deconstructed sufficiently. And I think, I'm not a startup person. I'm a ask questions person. And I get excited by that need. And I think maybe the folks that like to do startups like to make stuff. And so maybe there's that impulse there. And I suspect that kind of how the financial constraints, the incentives that are kind of driving how those businesses work are probably more geared towards build to learn. Um, I was in an enterprise conversation yesterday, and they were talking about the thing they really, really wanted to build. They had some interesting insights about it. But as they were talking, I just started thinking about all the questions that we would want to answer. So, right, the best path is somewhere in the middle, right? If you talk to me, I'm going to come up with all the things that we'd want to learn in order to make this thing succeed. And if you talk to a lot of startup people, they might want to just build it and get it out there in order to learn. I think somewhere in the middle, right? What's the, and this is a terrible phrase, but like, what's the minimum viable insight, right? Like, what's the right amount to learn first, I think, about that problem that's been identified to sort of understand the problem enough to start building and learning, and then have a build and learn cycle go. And I may be, I'm probably not gonna wouldn't be successful at that, because I think there are a lot of forces that really drive that build first mindset. And I think, in our culture, we love confidence, and I think confidence becomes arrogance if we're not careful. I think that confidence about a problem and even the confidence about a solution, I think is really inspirational. And I want to have research support and empower that confidence. Because I think confidence can
Mm.
pivot, confidence can grow and shift, and arrogance will not. Arrogance has to protect itself. So sorry, I've gotten a little philosophical there. I'm not sure if that
No,
helps
yeah,
us
yeah.
think
Maybe,
about.
yeah, one more specific thing on that. I mean, one common mistake that I've seen founders make is that, I mean, they probably, let's say, first they build some prototype or some concept, and they would go to the user, ask, hey, if you would use it, if you would pay for it, how much would you pay for it, right? And when they launch the product, this does not, none of those stand true. Like no one's using the
Yeah.
product, no one's paying that. Uh, so maybe it has more to do with how did they take those insights, right? I mean, you just asked whether they want it or not. That is, I think, one wrong thing that that happened to their life to create something which no one wanted, right? So how can just what is the quickest way for them to learn not to make those mistakes? I mean, probably they
Yeah.
cannot hire external consultants, they cannot
Sure.
probably read books, but what can they, in short, do to fix that?
I mean, I think you described it really, really well, right? I'm a startup founder. I built this prototype. I think it addresses something. Asking somebody, do you want this? Do you like this? Hey, isn't this great? Sometimes there's a little bit of a
Uh,
pride that kind of comes, which is sort of natural, but um, that you can kind of facilitate people to give you the answers you're looking
mm,
for,
mm,
right?
mm,
And if you are, a confident person, you say, "Hey, look at this thing, isn't this great?" Or, "Wouldn't you want this?" People will say yes. So I think asking those wrong questions is going to create the challenge you're talking about. Um, but putting things in front of people is a great method. So putting things in front of people and saying, you can say very little sometimes. Tell me about this.
mm,
What do you think? What does this do? What value does this provide? Without even saying, what would you do? Like, I think you don't have to point at that person and you
mm,
can
mm,
use that kind of influence over them, but just ask them, it's kind of neutral. We're two people, we're looking at a thing. Let's talk about that thing. Like I've shown people prototypes, like in this example you're talking about, and my clients had all these questions. But
mm,
sometimes the best question that you ask after you show a prototype is nothing. You just show the
uh,
prototype and you kind of finish showing it to somebody, and they start telling you what they think about it. And so they pick the attributes that are most important to give feedback on. And sometimes you have other ones you want to learn about,
mm,
so you can follow up with that. But people will tell you what this thing is, how they understand, what mental model they've created about it.
mm,
Sometimes I've asked people like, oh, who do you think should make this? Like, is this a quote Apple product or is this an Atlassian product? Right. And without even putting those words into people's mouths, they'll start to create it's the storytelling thing that you're talking about.
mm,
You give
mm,
people the chance to create a story about your thing that's not about would you buy it, because you're not trying to sell it to that person as in this interview. You're trying to understand how the thing that you believe in appears to somebody who's not you. How do they make sense of it? How do they talk about it? And it takes, right, it's sort of easy for me to say, but I think it's really hard for people who are excited and passionate about something to be
mm,
quiet and sort of still and just let somebody else tell them about their thing. Because you're going to hear, if we do that, we're going to hear somebody say something that's not what we want to hear. This is
mm,
a product for teenagers. This is a product that would be like for an expert in onboarding. This is a product for that. And that's not what you want to hear. But it's an answer that you need to hear, right? I think so. To your point, if a startup founder can go and ask some questions and just be really still and kind of hold back and let somebody else tell them what narrative they create about their thing, then they know what to go work on, like how to iterate. Either they
yeah.
lean in that direction or they have to make some changes in order to make
Mm,
their
mm.
message or their objective, much clearer.
Yeah, that's a great advice, Steve. I think uh, it's not a very uh, it's not a topic that is very much talked about within founders. I think this will be this advice will be really helpful for them. In a very short amount of time, they can have like they can at least get a theme of what not to do. All right. So thanks for sharing that. So shifting gears, Steve, I think next thing that I wanted to talk about was all these new emerging trends of AI and how is that going to change how we build products, how we do user research, how we design it. What do you think about that? Given that like in the like the one trend that I see is that like mostly developers are like quickly shipping product because you can just build products on top of AI. There are APIs, LLM models available. You can just ship product, which is happening right now. Uh, what do you see will happen next in terms of the evolution of user research design and all?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tricky topic to be predicting anything about because it's just changing so rapidly.
Mm,
Um, and I just was doing a review of some different AI technologies used for work without looking at the technologies, but just looking at how people are talking about them. Um, and I don't think this is particularly, novel observation, but boy, there's a lot of hype. Right? You can find descriptions of capabilities that are entirely speculative. And so you have, developers with what I understand are like some pretty robust tools for building apps, for, finding the right code, for checking code. But there are other things out there that are like, tools to do summarization. And I think those are getting better. Um, but will they be able to pull out, I think it's going to be interesting to see, if you take an interview transcript and you have an LLM do some kind of summarization versus, how somebody else is going to, how a human's going to make sense of it. I don't know. I was talking to a friend of mine who's quite smart research leader, and I'm going to misquote them, but he said something about an LLM can never do synthesis because an LLM is just backwards looking, but synthesis is about creating new
mm,
connections.
mm,
That was a really interesting kind of way to frame it. Um, I think there's these interesting models of humans and robots, kind of working together where the technology kind of extends their capability as opposed to replaces it. And I was looking a little bit about like AI chess, which is not like coding, right? Has been an area where there's just been, machine doing chess for forever. And there's this term, and I may have this wrong, but there's this term of the centaur, like from Greek mythology, half human, half animal. That I think this is true that the you have the human player and you have the machine player, but the centaur player, which is a collaboration between the two, I think right now outperforms both, outperforms
got
machine
it.
only and human
Mm,
only.
mm, mm, mm,
And I hope I don't have that too wrong, but it sort of raises interesting, sort of almost philosophical questions about like what does a researcher do, or a developer doing research? What does anyone who does research do that is enhanced by AI, as opposed to like, right, just taking us out of the equation and just dropping one form of data into the next. Right. I think AIs are so good at, as good at so many kinds of things, like at scale, finding patterns, that sort of thing. Um, so yeah, I think things are going to change in the quality. I think there's stuff that's out there. Someone wrote me yesterday. They said, someone sent me a message. They said, "Hey, Steve, I just asked an AI to like organize some survey responses, and I don't think researchers have to worry about being replaced anytime soon." So that was their kind of critique about the
mm,
actual performance.
mm,
And that may change, and that may change really, really quickly. Um, but how does our work look? It kind of goes back almost to the democratization thing, which is like who's doing research and kind of how are we doing it? And I think this is sort of a further question. What tools are we going to use to make sense of this stuff? Um, we have automated transcription right now, and no one talks about it or thinks about it. It's actually like not great. And we've sort of tolerated, I think, kind of crappy transcription. Um, and so I think that's seen as an improvement for people that were never doing transcription. But if you were someone that, a researcher, we always got transcripts because it was always what we needed. Um, so that's a form of artificial intelligence that has changed kind of the way that we work, and we've just kind of taken it in stride. It's a new tool. It's an improvement to a tool. So I don't know. I'm not being very conclusive, but you're just, getting me to think about sort of all the facets of it. I think it will change. I don't think anybody knows. I don't think we're going to get replaced. I think there's opportunities to kind of think about sort of supporting what we do with tools that are maybe like transcription that can kind of like save time, remove drudgery, and kind of, maybe bring us something new that we couldn't see before.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And to build AI products which are new in nature, is there any analogy that uh, which we can derive from, let's say, early 2000s, where we were new to digital products, now we are new to AI? Is there any pattern that you see?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of interesting human questions, like the skills that are needed to work with an AI, right? Creating prompts like, all right, an AI would help me get, revise a draft of something. But what does that actually look like? And how do
Hmm.
we, if you want to create a system for doing that, I think there's an interesting research opportunity about like how do people on board to working with
Hmm.
a general purpose AI or like a specific, specific domain specific AI. Um, because yeah, we are in early days. And so the prospective users of this are naive and we have mental models that are wrong. And
Hmm.
so how do we help the product help the person start to use it? Training wheels or scaffolding or advertising campaigns or whatever that is to kind of create some more literacy around that. I think there's going to be some workplace literacy that's going to be needed. And does that fall to HR or IT or so I think these are great research questions to be answered about how these products are going to succeed as they go into new markets with new users. And this is right. This is your analogy is great, right? Every product or technology that goes from like niche educated users to a more mass market has a learning curve, has sort of a pain of adoption there. And I think that's going to be interesting. And I think just yeah, great research opportunities are there. From a usability point of
Hmm.
view, from a understanding workflow, understanding sort of meaning,
Hmm.
and mental models. I think there's just all these different aspects there that are going to be great research projects that will help these products, find their
Yeah,
users, find their value.
yeah, yeah. Agree with that, Steve. So, all right, Steve, I think those were all the questions that I had for you. And it was really great chatting with you. And I hope everyone watching this will be able to learn a lot of things from this. And Steve, also, I would like to know how can like people who are looking at this can purchase your book, and if there's any discount code for them. Yeah, maybe let's
We
talk
can
about
hold the
that.
book up. That's the thing. We'll hold the book up. Yeah, this is the second edition of Interviewing Users. The first edition was 10 years ago, and the second edition is brand new. The best place to buy it is from the publisher, Rosenfeld Media, at rosenfeldmedia.com. And you can support small businesses and support authors by buying it from the publisher. And there's a discount code. I think it's for 20% off. And the discount code is one word, get curious. And yeah, from Rosenfeld Media is where you use that code to get that discount.
All right, I'll put that code as well in the description as well as in the comments so that everyone can access it. Great, Steve. Thanks for joining the conversation. Thanks for your time. Really great chatting with you.
Great to speak with you. Thanks for the opportunity.